July 2, 1944. The French village of Isigny-sur-Mer lay soaked in salt air and the ash of shattered farms. The war had rolled through here only weeks ago, churning fields into tank traps and gardens into craters. But now, at dawn, the fog lifted not with the scent of blood or gunpowder, but with something far stranger. It smelled like oil, steel, baked bread. Oberstleutnant Franz Schneider adjusted his Feldmütze and peered down from the crest of the bluff near La Cambre. He had spent the past 48 hours overseeing a desperate rearguard retreat toward Saint-Lô, and now, finally, he could rest. Or so he thought. The sound reached him first, a distant, rhythmic grinding. Schneider stiffened. He thought it was the rumble of tanks at first, then perhaps trucks or artillery convoys moving on gravel roads, but the pitch was wrong. He lifted his binoculars. The channel glinted through the haze, calm as glass, and then the fog parted and his stomach turned to ice. Below, stretching from the surf to the tree line, were lines of cranes taller than the church steeples, spewing boxes from steel ships onto sand. The horizon was full of hulls, massive Liberty ships moored in rows like a floating city. Men, trucks, crates, bulldozers, radios, bulldozers pulling radios. Supply ships opened like jaws, vomiting tanks onto artificial docks that hadn't existed 2 weeks ago. It wasn't a port. It was a factory. A moving, expanding factory. Schneider lowered the binoculars. He couldn't speak. Behind him, one of his aides stepped up, breathless. "Oberst, our scouts report American columns linking from Omaha and Utah sectors. The 29th and 4th Infantry Divisions are pushing east. It's—" Schneider cut him off. "I don't care about infantry right now. Look at that, look at it." They both stood in silence, watching another Liberty ship dock at what the Americans called a Mulberry Harbor, an entire pier built from floating steel pontoons, dragged across the channel and assembled in days. A crane swung out, unloading wooden pallets in rhythmic bursts, fuel drums, tinned meat, medical kits, shells, ammunition belts stacked in metal containers, each labeled and logged with a precision that bordered on terrifying. The sheer speed of it, one ship emptied in less than 2 hours. And then another slid in to take its place. That day alone, Schneider would learn, the Allies offloaded over 250,000 tons of material onto Normandy beaches, the daily capacity of both Mulberry Harbors combined. It was more than the entire German 7th Army had been supplied with during the last 6 weeks. He tried to compute it, he couldn't. By the time German horse carts delivered a single crate of 75 shells, the Americans had already landed 10 more truckloads behind them. "Das ist unmöglich," the aide whispered. But it was. Schneider watched jeeps roll down ramps like they'd been churned out of a press. Fresh uniforms, full bellies, soldiers eating chocolate bars as they offloaded crates of bazookas. The Americans weren't just landing men. They were landing replacement parts, prefab airstrips, radios by the thousands, rail cars, folding bridges. The Germans had planned for beaches. They hadn't planned for ports that moved. Behind Schneider, another explosion echoed from the east, the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division trying to hold Saint-Lô. The officer didn't flinch. He just stared at the horizon. He had studied Clausewitz. He had believed in blitzkrieg. But this was not blitzkrieg. This was gravity. It could not be stopped. It could only be survived. He turned away, walking back toward his staff car, legs heavy. "Have someone bring me the fuel logistics from Caen. I want to know how long our reserves can hold if they keep this up." "How long, Oberst?" the aide asked. Schneider stopped walking. "If they're landing 250,000 tons a day." He looked toward the sea again. "Then our front already doesn't exist. It just hasn't collapsed yet." The road to St. Lo was more mud than asphalt now, carved with the retreating tracks of panzer divisions and the broken shoes of infantry who hadn't slept in days. Oberstleutnant Franz Schneider stood beneath a warped power pole, staring at what was left of his column. Half a dozen Opel Blitz trucks idled in the trees, their engines choking on watered-down fuel. The rest had been abandoned along the hedgerows, engines seized, tires shredded. One tank remained, a Panzer IV with a cracked turret ring and a crew that hadn't eaten since Thursday. The retreat wasn't organized anymore. It was just controlled collapse. Schneider had once believed in the iron will of the Wehrmacht, but iron didn't bend like this. He climbed into the command car and pulled a soaked map from his satchel. A black grease pencil traced the American front, or what intelligence claimed it was. The lines had become meaningless. Every night, his men reported enemy units behind positions that should have been safe. American patrols moved with a flexibility that defied logic. They always seemed rested, always armed, always fed. And Schneider knew why. Behind every rifleman came a supply chain that moved like a heartbeat. The Americans didn't just bring bullets, they brought replacement barrels, spare boots, rations that didn't spoil in the sun. They built roads where there were none. They flew in medical tents larger than Schneider's headquarters. He had seen the truth from the cliffs. The Allies weren't outrunning the Germans. They were outbuilding them. A dispatch rider approached, saluting weakly. Oberst radio intercepts. Forward observers report a new Allied drop zone opened east of Kärnten. Gliders, more engineers, portable bridges. Schneider didn't even look up. What's the rail condition at St. Lo? Blown out by our own demolitions, sir, and the depot's still burning. Of course it was. Every time the Wehrmacht tried to delay the Americans, it cost them something vital. Bridges blown meant their own supply lines vanished. But what else could they do? The enemy didn't need fixed rail. They brought trucks. Thousands of them. Schneider had watched a convoy stretch from the cliffs to the horizon once. Jeeps, GMC CCKWs, bulldozers towing trailers filled with tents, fuel drums, even prefabricated latrines. The Americans didn't wait for cities. They built their own. And every night, his men found leaflets in their boots or on the windshields of captured vehicles. We never stopped moving. The front didn't break like glass. It crumbled like old bread. By the time Schneider reached his divisional HQ outside St. Lo, the front had shifted again. Another company gone, cut off by what scouts described as mobile columns, appearing from woods the Germans had assumed were impassable. Schneider stared across the open fields from a church bell tower, searching for the enemy. But they were never visible in one place. They moved like water, fast, silent, inevitable. Below him, a squad of Volksgrenadiers huddled under tarps, sharing a single cold can of pork. Their boots were mismatched. One man had no helmet. Schneider spotted something else, a discarded ration tin near the fence. He climbed down and kicked it over. American still clean. A chocolate wrapper lay beside it. His heart sank. The Americans had been here already. He returned to the command tent where his staff officers argued over impossible requests. One needed artillery shells. Another wanted fuel. A third demanded men, real men, not boys fresh from conscription. Schneider slammed his hand on the table. Stop. They froze. Do you want to know why we're losing? He asked, voice cold. They looked at each other. No one answered. He reached into his map case and dropped a wrinkled document onto the table. A copy of a decoded Allied supply report, intercepted 3 days earlier. It was only one page. June 30th, Omaha Sector Logistics. 8,800 tons of ammunition. 7,200 tons of petrol, oil, lubricants. 3,100 tons of rations. 1,500 tons of vehicles. 2,400 tons of medical and support equipment. Total 23,000 tons in 24 hours. Sector 1. One sector, one beach, one day. Schneider looked up. Now multiply that by all 5 beachheads. Multiply that by the ships still arriving. Multiply that by the airfields they're building behind the hedgerows. A long silence followed. They can afford to lose equipment. We can't afford to lose a shovel. That evening, American artillery began hammering the hills north of the city. At first it was sporadic, probing, but by dusk it became a rolling thunder, not coordinated barrages, but mechanical consistency. Shells every few seconds, minute after minute. Each battery supplied, reloaded, rotated with mathematical precision. A junior lieutenant stumbled into Schneider's command dugout, eyes wide. "Oberst, the Americans, they have lights. They're unloading trucks through the night. They built floodlights on the road to Kärnten." Schneider said nothing. That was the moment he knew. Not just that the front would fall, but that Germany, the whole Reich, had already lost. Not from lack of bravery, not from tactical failure, but from a nation that could move 250,000 tons of war every day across an ocean, and still find time to build floodlights so its convoys wouldn't stop moving. That kind of war was beyond defeat. A crow landed on a burned-out Hanomag beside the road to Kautenses, hopping over the twisted hull of what had once been an armored personnel carrier. The bird didn't flinch when a distant shell burst in the hills. It had grown used to the sound. So had the men. Southwest of St. Lo, Schneider stood in what passed for a regimental HQ, a bombed-out barn with half a roof and a blackboard nailed to a hay wagon. Maps were pinned by bayonets to the walls, corners curling in the heat. But no matter how they redrew the lines, the results were the same. Every road, every path, every fallback route compromised. The Americans didn't advance like an army. They spread like oil through cracks in concrete. There were no neat lines, no concentrated pushes, just constant pressure in every direction. Schneider pointed to a railway junction near Perriers. This was the last intact supply route north. Where are we on the countermove? A lieutenant flipped through his notes. Ambushed, last night. They moved a mobile column through the forest, engineers followed behind. Repaired the bridge they'd just blown. Our scouts said they're running resupply trucks along the same route by now. They built a bridge in a night. Not even 4 hours. Schneider didn't swear, he didn't look shocked, he simply erased the line. Behind him the barn wall trembled. An Allied shell hit somewhere in the west, maybe 6 kilometers out. The shells no longer came in patterns, they came like punctuation. Constant, regular, shrugging off terrain like it didn't matter. In a way, it didn't, because the Americans didn't need to hold the terrain. They just needed to move through it, faster than the Germans could build a defense. And always, the supplies flowed behind them. That was the worst part. At night, Schneider could see them. Dozens of miles behind the front, in places where the Luftwaffe no longer dared fly, great bonfires lit the roads as GIs offloaded crates under electric light. Diesel fumes filled the fields. The silhouettes of cranes danced like shadows of industry, long thought unreachable. The Wehrmacht had trained its officers in maneuver warfare. The Americans had trained their quartermasters to move mountains. And the mountains were winning. By July 14th, Schneider had stopped counting how many trucks they'd lost. He sat beside a ravine overlooking a crossroads, watching an American column roll north toward Lesse. The road was intact. It should have been cratered, but the Allies had brought graders, steamrollers, asphalt-mixing trailers. They didn't take roads. They made them. Every truck that passed, every jeep, every trailer had full tires, painted unit numbers, proper cargo netting. Some of the GIs smoked as they drove. They were so far from danger, they didn't even bother ducking. "Why aren't we shooting at them?" asked Unteroffizier Bremer beside him. Schneider didn't answer, he just tapped his rangefinder. They had no artillery in range. The batteries had been pulled back after the St. Lo breakthrough. What was left had no shells. The Luftwaffe had no fuel to launch airstrikes. The Panzer divisions had been rerouted to plug other holes, all of which had since become craters. Bremer looked again at the American convoy. "They're not even guarding their flanks." "They don't need to," Schneider said quietly. "They have 10 more convoys behind that one. If we destroy this," he shrugged, "they just build another." In a trench 10 kilometers east, Feldwebel Jonas Meissner stared at the box of rifle cartridges he'd been issued that morning. 24 rounds. They'd been scrounged from 3 different depots. Some were Polish manufacture, some French. The powder loads were inconsistent. One bullet had corrosion on the tip. And still, his orders were to hold the forest road and expect heavy American mechanized pressure. He looked to his left, 1 machine gun, 2 belts, a crew of teenagers from Hamburg with 4 days of training. To his right, the woods stretched empty. He adjusted his helmet, then he heard it. Not the footsteps of infantry, not the roar of tanks. It was the rumble of tires, the kind of sound only American convoys made, deep, regular, almost indifferent. He rose just enough to peer through the brush. And his blood ran cold. It wasn't just trucks. It was graders, bulldozers, radio towers, fuel tankers. They weren't coming to fight. They were coming to stay. Far to the west, Schneider stood over a newly captured American vehicle, a 6-wheeled supply truck his men had intercepted during the night. The driver had fled, but the cargo was intact. Schneider climbed into the back, wiping diesel off the shipping manifest bolted to the wall. He read it twice. 24 crates of bandages, 5 generators, 3 miles of insulated field wire, half a ton of instant coffee, a dozen rolls of canvas, spare spark plugs. It wasn't even a frontline unit's truck. It was just another heartbeat in the American machine. And this one heartbeat carried more functional logistics than his entire divisional rear echelon. That realization hit him harder than any shell. He looked back at the corporal who had brought him the truck. What unit intercepted this? 4th Infantry. Schneider closed his eyes. The 4th Infantry had been in the Kärnten sector 4 days ago. That meant their supply lines had already moved 30 kilometers in less than a week. His own men were still waiting for bread from last Tuesday. The front wasn't a front anymore. It was an open wound, and the Americans poured steel into it faster than the Germans could bleed. In a field outside Le Mesnil, Schneider assembled his remaining battalion commanders under cover of darkness. There were fewer now, some had been killed, some cut off, others simply gone, dissolved by chaos. He marked new defensive lines in the dirt. One of the officers, a grizzled major who had fought in Poland, France, and Russia, looked at him and said, "Even if we hold, for how long?" Schneider didn't look up. He didn't need to. They all knew the answer. Long enough for another 250,000 tons to land. And then another. And then another. Until the line wasn't holding at all. It was simply dissolving in slow motion. The first sign was always the sound. A low hum, distant, mechanical, not the thunder of artillery or the scream of dive bombers, but the patient growl of engines that never seemed to stop. In the summer of 1944, French peasants near Perriers began waking in the dark, not to birdsong or shell bursts, but to the dull vibration of American convoys moving through ground still damp with blood. By the time the sun rose, the trucks were gone. In their place were paved roads, improvised depots, field kitchens, and crates, always crates. Inside what remained of German Army Group B's southern corridor, Oberstleutnant Franz Schneider stood before an open map with 10 arrows drawn in charcoal. They weren't tactical formations. They were guesses, possible paths of American penetration based on captured messages, burned supply manifests, and the few functioning reconnaissance planes still left to the Luftwaffe. None of it helped, because by the time German command identified where the Americans were, they weren't anymore. They had moved forward and left behind an entire army of supplies. He studied the latest reports from the 7th Army's Quartermaster General. 2 railway cars of fuel missing. Rations 2 days left. Mortar shells 13 per battery. Radio batteries empty. Meanwhile, British radio chatter from Caen estimated the Allies had offloaded 3,000 tons of spare parts in a single day. 3,000 tons of things that weren't even needed yet. Spare spark plug, valve covers, camshafts, shoelaces. It was like trying to stop an avalanche with your hands. In the village of Le Desert, what remained of the 2nd SS Panzer Division tried to regroup around a churchyard. A few tanks, all low on fuel. No air support. No reserve. An engineer captain approached Schneider near the bell tower, his face pale. "Oberst, we can't repair the bridge at Pont Brocard. The Americans shelled our depot. We've lost the cranes. Use winches, use ropes." "We don't have rope. We requisitioned everything already, even electrical cable." "Then steel wire from houses, fences." The captain looked at him with empty eyes. "The houses are gone." Schneider didn't answer. He couldn't. He simply walked outside and looked at the road to the west and saw the dust cloud. It was distant, a rising tail of dust moving like a snake across the horizon, another American column. Hours later, from a concealed ridgeline, Schneider watched as a U.S. maintenance convoy pulled off the road, uncoiling hoses and setting up what appeared to be a mobile tire shop. They weren't even in combat range. They were just pausing to check equipment. A jeep passed by. The driver leaned out and tossed something onto the shoulder. Schneider's binoculars caught the object as it tumbled end over end. A coffee can. Unopened. A full ration, discarded casually. His men were drinking boiled ditch water. By July 19th, German lines in Normandy no longer resembled a front. They resembled a net, torn in 20 places and fraying more each day. Pockets formed without orders. Retreats happened without reports. The 9th Panzer Division had fallen back from St. George without firing a shot. They simply ran out of fuel. Their tanks now sat abandoned in hayfields, blackened from self-destruction charges or looted by locals. One had been repurposed by an American ordnance unit as a makeshift billboard, painted across the hull in English. "Thank you for the steel." The psychological blow struck deeper than any shell. Schneider's driver, a 20-year-old from Dresden, asked him one morning, "Why don't they stop? They've won already." Schneider stared at the convoy moving past their latest fallback position. Engineers unloading crates of bridge trusses and pre-cut roadbed. "They don't stop," he said softly, "because they never intended to fight like us." He gestured at the crates. "We send men with rifles and hope the fuel catches up. They send fuel first, then rifles, then roads, then tents, then newspapers." The boy blinked. "Newspapers." "Found one in a ditch. Stars and stripes. They have journalists embedded with their engineers." The boy was silent for a long time. What kind of army brings printing presses to a battlefield? Schneider didn't reply, but he knew. An army that never planned to leave. A week later, the roads out of St. Lo became death traps. Not because of American firepower, but because the Wehrmacht couldn't even evacuate its wounded anymore. Medical vehicles lay empty, Drivers were dead, fuel was gone, horses had been eaten. By contrast, Schneider's scouts reported that the Americans were now ferrying wounded by air. Entire C-47 squadrons evacuating casualties to floating hospitals in the Channel. Even their pain moved faster than German bullets. The tipping point came on July 22nd. It wasn't an offensive. It wasn't even a battle. It was a traffic jam. American trucks had backed up outside Pont Hebert due to a bottleneck. Too many vehicles trying to cross a single floating bridge. It should have been a disaster. But within 2 hours, the engineers arrived with portable causeways. By sundown, 3 more lanes of traffic were flowing. Supplies surged forward again. And Schneider, watching from an orchard 3 kilometers away, finally whispered to his aide, "This is not a war. This is demolition. Slow, constant, perfect demolition." He tried one last appeal, a desperate request sent to the Corps command post, urging emergency rail shipments of ammunition from Brittany. The reply came the next day. Trains disabled, bridges out, no rolling stock remaining. Underneath, a handwritten note from the colonel at headquarters. Use bicycles if possible. Schneider folded the message slowly, as if it might disintegrate in his fingers. Then he stood and walked out of the command post without saying a word. Because when the enemy delivers 250,000 tons of fresh war every day, and your own army is told to use bicycles, you are no longer part of a war. You are part of a retreat that just hasn't been officially declared. The roads east of St. Lo had turned to powder beneath American treads. They no longer resembled roads so much as arteries, veins of gravel and compacted dirt pulsing with trucks, ambulances, jeeps, and mobile depots. Where the Wehrmacht saw terrain, the Americans saw throughput. And where Schneider once tracked enemy troop concentrations, now he tried to map their fuel routes. It had become an obsession. He sat alone in a former schoolhouse, long since converted into a field HQ, tracing pencil lines over every village that had a well, a pump, or even a half-buried fuel drum. It didn't matter anymore where the GIs attacked. What mattered was where they refueled. Because wherever fuel flowed, the Americans followed. He marked 2 more towns, Lelaurie and Villeboden. Both had fallen within hours, not because the defenders lacked courage, but because the enemy never stopped coming. For every road the Germans mined, engineers cleared 3 more. For every convoy ambushed, 2 arrived overnight with replacements. A captured intelligence briefing found on a dead American officer described the supply movement in cold, terrifying numbers. Fuel target by D+42, 1,500 tons per day per corps. PAL delivery via barge from Cherbourg, 30% ahead of schedule. Red Ball Express lanes prioritized for high-octane cargo. All units to receive backup stocks by 1800 hours. There were no delays, no bottlenecks. Even Cherbourg, bombed half to hell, had been operational within weeks, not just operational, functional at industrial scale. In another war, Schneider might have admired it. In this one, he could only flee from it. On July 25th, the sound of motors thundered from the west, but this time it wasn't just convoys. It was tanks. Thousands of them. Operation Cobra had begun. Schneider's staff barely had time to finish their coffee before the artillery started. Over 1,500 Allied bombers hit a 15-mile front in under 2 hours. Trees were vaporized. Earth turned to ash. Whole battalions vanished beneath waves of fire and concussion. By noon, American armor rolled through craters still smoldering. Columns of Shermans and M10 tank destroyers moved not as spearheads, but as bulldozers, grinding through what was left of German lines. They didn't probe for weakness. They created it. And behind them always came more trucks, A corporal in Schneider's command platoon muttered, "They've brought a factory to war." No one corrected him. 2 days later, in a forest clearing north of Lebany Bocage, Schneider convened what would be his last divisional war council. The officers present resembled scarecrows, uniforms soaked, boots worn to the soles, hollow-eyed and wordless. He opened the meeting by reading a captured American field resupply schedule for Patton's Third Army. Estimated advance rate, 20 km/day. Daily tonnage requirement, 504,000 tons. Road networks prioritized by Engineering Battalions 91st, 110th, and 184th. Backup supplies to follow within 12 hours. The major from the 77th Regiment looked up. "This is impossible." "No," Schneider said, voice level, "it is the future." That night, while his men slept in slit trenches, Schneider walked alone into the woods and sat on the edge of a ridge overlooking a distant crossroads. The headlights of American vehicles moved like stars across the landscape, a constant, slow pulse of light. He heard a harmonica, then a laugh, then the click of a Zippo lighter. Someone below was cooking. They were not in a rush. They didn't have to be. Because his front, no longer held shape. The Germans had no strategic reserve. Their tanks were deadweight, their roads cratered, their ammo wagons empty. He picked up a pinecone and rolled it between his fingers. Once, he had believed that sheer determination could turn the tide, that holding firm meant something. But how do you hold against velocity? Elsewhere that same week, a Feldgendarmerie officer tried to organize a defense at the town of Saint-Sauveur-Lendelin. He had 2 machine guns, 30 riflemen, and a single PaK-40 with no HE shells. When the Americans arrived, they came not as a vanguard but as a wall, a thunderous, rolling column of tanks, trucks, and mobile howitzers supported by wire teams and engineers laying out fuel drums like bread crumbs. Within hours, the defenders were either dead or gone. Not because the enemy was faster, but because they were everywhere. Schneider read the final report that night in a ruined farmhouse. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed that the Red Ball Express, a 24/7 supply convoy running from Cherbourg to the front, was moving over 5,000 vehicles per day, over 12,000 tons of equipment, food, and ammunition. Every day. The Allied plan wasn't just to destroy German divisions. It was to bury them in fuel, drown them in crates, smother them in radios, medical tents, spare tires, and coffee. And it was working. One of Schneider's last transmissions to Army Group B was brief. He tapped the key slowly, deliberately. Lines disintegrating not from enemy combat, but from inability to sustain. Withdrawal no longer a tactical option, only directionless flight remains. No reply came. There was no one left to answer. The fields near Avranches were burning again, but no one came to put them out. The fire brigade had been conscripted months ago, the pump engines stripped for rubber, the men sent east, then never seen again. By August 1st, Franz Schneider no longer kept a headquarters. He moved from barn to barn, orchard to orchard, carried by the ghost of an army that no longer existed on paper. His map case, once bulging with supply manifests and fuel allocations, now held only one document, a captured American logistics briefing marked Forward Command Use Only. He read it by candlelight for the 100th time. It was organized like a corporate flowchart. Boxes and arrows connecting seaports to inland depots to mobile resupply hubs to regimental needs, each linked by fuel, food, and exact tonnage metrics. But it wasn't the detail that haunted him. It was the tone. It sounded calm, inevitable, not the language of war but of delivery schedules. He folded the paper and stepped into the night. In the distance, engines rumbled over gravel. They were American, Of course they were. German vehicles no longer moved after dark, they didn't have the petrol, and even if they did, the Allies owned the roads. Not with flags. With convoys. And every convoy, Schneider had come to understand, was a moving declaration of defeat. A report came in from the Mortain sector. It was short, armor surrounded, ammunition depleted, counterattack failed, requesting fuel. There was nothing Schneider could do. The fuel depots had been destroyed, not by bombing but by exhaustion. The drums had been drained weeks ago. Some were now used as shelters from rain. Others were buried to avoid detection. The panzer regiments had taken to hiding their tanks in woods, hoping to lure Americans into ambushes. But the Americans didn't take the bait. They didn't need to. They simply drove around the forest, built a bypass road using bulldozers, and kept going. Schneider sat on the hood of an abandoned Kubelwagen, watching a distant American airstrip being assembled on a hill outside of Villedieu. It had appeared overnight. 6 gliders, 4 bulldozers, 2 squadrons of engineers. By mid-morning, the first P-47 landed. By evening, the strip was active, its radios humming. Fuel bladders had been airlifted in. Machine guns mounted on sandbag walls. Tents already pitched in rows. It wasn't an airfield. It was a declaration, you can't stop this. He stared through binoculars at the men working shirtless, relaxed, whistling. A few waved at his observation point, fully aware that German artillery no longer reached this far. They didn't bother to hide. Why should they? He turned to his aide. Do you see what that is? The young man squinted. A temporary landing strip. No, Schneider said. It's permanence built on speed. The next morning, Schneider found himself in a roadside cafe whose walls still bore the faded stenciling of the Vichy regime. The windows had been blown out. A bicycle hung from the rafters, nailed there like a crucifix. On the table lay a rusted radio receiver. Schneider turned the dial, static. Then, faintly English, American swing music, Benny Goodman. He smiled without humor. The Americans weren't just winning with guns. They were winning with culture. A sergeant entered, helmet dented, hands muddy. He reported that the fallback positions east of Vire had collapsed. The defenders weren't killed. They'd simply abandoned their weapons and scattered. Some had thrown down rifles in exchange for bread offered by French civilians. They didn't surrender, the sergeant said bitterly. They evaporated. Schneider poured cold coffee into a tin mug. And who can blame them? They've seen the horizon. He meant the trucks. As the Red Ball Express expanded, its presence became mythological. To Schneider's scattered units, it felt omnipresent, like a vein of iron pumping across every hill, every ridge, every retreat path. It moved with military escort, motorcycle outriders, constant motion. If one truck broke down, it was pushed aside in seconds. If a bridge collapsed, engineers laid steel mats and crossed it before sunset. Some units reported hearing its convoys even when they weren't there, the brain filling in the inevitability. One veteran whispered to his commander, even their logistics march in step. By mid-August, Schneider's battalion had been reduced to 94 men and a single functioning machine gun. They had no rations, no water purification, and no working radio. He issued no more orders. There was nothing left to command. They bivouacked in the ruins of a farmhouse outside Tinchebray. From a second-story window, Schneider spotted something absurd: an American soldier shaving in a mirror nailed to the door of a fuel truck. There was no rush, no fear, just efficiency. The GIs had even set up folding chairs. One man was reading a book. He leaned into the scope of his rifle, just to look. The book's title, The Grapes of Wrath. Schneider let out a breath. Not only were the Americans invading, they brought their literature with them. He finally understood what the Allies had done. They hadn't landed an army. They de-landed a civilization. Every bullet came with a mechanic. Every tank came with a blueprint. Every footstep forward was carried by 1,000 wheels. He once read that war is politics by other means. But this war, this version, was production by other means. In the final days of August, Schneider wrote a letter to his brother, a school teacher in Dresden. He didn't mail it. There was no one left to carry letters, but he wrote it anyway. I no longer fear being killed. That's the easy part. What I fear is waking up every day knowing that no matter how hard our men fight, no matter how precise our formations, how sharp our aim, we will lose because they can keep moving, and we cannot. I used to think courage would win the day. Now I think rubber tires and canned meat will do it instead. They are not just defeating our army, they are replacing it with roads. He folded the letter and tucked it into his breast pocket. Maybe someone would find it later, maybe not. It didn't matter. The front no longer held. But the supplies did. September 3rd, 1944. The skies over Belgium were streaked with C-47s dropping fuel bladders by parachute into fields that had been German strongholds mere days earlier. Where once the Wehrmacht had marked the borders of conquest with flags and ceremonies, now the Americans marked theirs with fuel markers and radio beacons. Franz Schneider stood beside a crumbling stone wall near Dinant, watching a tractor-trailer, an actual civilian tractor-trailer, commandeered and American-flagged, reverse toward a temporary depot built just 2 days earlier by the 343rd Engineer Regiment. The war, he realized, was no longer being fought in battlefields. It was being fought with scheduling. The truck driver, a GI in a sweat-stained undershirt, stepped down, lit a cigarette, and waved casually at a corporal managing the offload. Schneider had once believed that battles were won by heroic last stands. Now he knew. They were won by men like this, men who showed up on time with 40 tons of gasoline. That evening, a horse-drawn cart creaked along a side road near Rochefort. In the back sat 4 German soldiers and 1 captain. None carried rifles. The cart had no military markings, and the horse was blind in one eye. They passed through villages, where children threw flowers at American convoys, and old women waved to tanks. One of the Germans muttered bitterly, "They don't even hate us anymore." The captain said nothing. He was too busy watching the trucks. There were hundreds of them. A rolling tide of olive-drab steel. Some bore pontoon bridges, others hauled bulldozers. Some were carrying tents, fuel drums, radio masts, and even prefabricated showers. It wasn't an army. It was a civilization in forward motion. Franz Schneider walked alone through the ruins of a railway junction once vital to German resupply in the Ardennes. Now it lay in silence, rails twisted, timbers blackened. American engineers hadn't bothered to repair it. They didn't need trains. They had built their own roads around it. 10 miles north, he watched 2 American MPs coordinate the unloading of portable latrines. Behind them, a refrigeration truck hummed. They weren't even in combat range, and yet here they were, delivering cold meat, hot coffee, and sanitation to the very edge of former German territory. Schneider looked down at his mud-caked boots and threadbare socks. There was no contest here. There never had been. When word reached him that the Siegfried Line would be the next fallback point, Schneider didn't laugh. He simply said, "And what will we hold it with? Dignity." The line had been built in another era, an era where war was measured by trenches, concrete, and artillery tubes. Now it would face an enemy measured in tons per hour. Even if the bunkers held, the roads behind them wouldn't, and the Americans would just pour around it with fuel to spare. By mid-September, the Allies had pushed so far so fast that their supply lines began to strain under their own speed. Eisenhower's staff issued warnings of logistical overextension, but these were theoretical, because even in overextension, the Americans moved. And where they moved, they laid cable, offloaded supplies, and handed out Hershey bars to children who no longer feared jackboots. The war wasn't ending in a roar. It was ending in diesel and rubber and canned peaches. Schneider picked up a discarded K-ration tin one morning, thrown from a passing convoy. On it, in English, "Fortified for combat endurance." He turned it over. "It's not the food," he whispered, "it's the promise." Outside of Aachen, a lieutenant in Schneider's remaining staff managed to intercept an American logistics officer who had been separated from his column. The man wore wire-rimmed glasses, carried a clipboard, and refused to flinch even as rifles were raised. He looked at Schneider calmly and asked in clean German, "Do you know how much fuel we dropped into this sector last week?" Schneider said nothing. 20,000 tons, the American answered before being blindfolded and taken away. "And more tomorrow." The Germans didn't interrogate him. There was no need. They believed him. The final report Schneider filed before dissolving his staff was not military in tone. It was mathematical. Enemy moves at a tempo beyond forecasting models. Units can no longer reconstitute due to lack of foundational logistics. Civilian infrastructure now belongs to Allied engineers. The enemy brings not just munitions, but continuity. Their front is not a line, it is a zone. And it grows daily. He wrote no signature. He affixed no stamp. He simply placed the page on the last intact desk in the village of Simmerath and walked west. On the morning of September 20th, Schneider surrendered to an American road repair team near Malmedy. They didn't have rifles, just clipboards, asphalt, and equipment. One of the sergeants offered him a canteen and asked if he'd eaten. When Schneider shook his head, the man reached into a ration box and handed him a sealed package of crackers, peanut butter, and powdered lemonade. It tasted like chalk. It tasted like victory. And Franz Schneider, former logistics commander of the 15th German Army, wept. Because in the end, it wasn't bombing or tanks or even soldiers that had undone the Reich. It was organization. In the war's aftermath, historians would call it the triumph of throughput. Others would speak of task force movements, armored spearheads, and air superiority. But Schneider, who survived the war, who later testified in tribunals and wrote logistics manuals for reconstruction, would remember it differently. He'd remember the sound, not of gunfire, but of trucks, rolling relentless, infinite. The sound that never stopped. The sound of a nation that did not run out.